Great. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me. As I was just mentioning, I've been, I've been attending the other presentations, and it's been really fantastic. And I feel very fortunate and grateful to be sitting here alongside all these other illustrious scholars on these subjects. And I think just to preface this, so I've actually been giving this presentation in different ways, and one of the things that's been, I guess, a positive challenge for me is because I've really been presenting it to really different audiences. So it could be like mental health professionals or academics. Um, so I'm hoping to catch the right tone for today. And I think just to maybe briefly introduce or maybe give a background on who I am. So, and why I'm in this subject, because I think it's quite uncommon to hear of maybe a psychologist to be interested in sort of the sociology of illness, and the politics of illness, etc. So my background, it was in cultural psychology. And I think, just to say in a nutshell, I was always very interested in how people across the world suffer differently, and sort of are the different meaning systems that exist. And it was through that that I became very interested in sort of the welfare of migrants and refugees, and particularly in Islamophobia. So my research background was focused on Islamophobia across the global north. That's what my PhD was on, that a long time ago. And I think one of the things that I found was always very awkward, in terms of both phrasing, but also in terms of ways of addressing it, was trying to understand how Muslims are racialized. People have a difficult time thinking about the racialization of Muslims, simply because Muslims are so diverse and obviously can't be categorized under one sort of phenotype. Um, and lo and behold, when I was in Canada, I heard about this prevent policy. And I applied to the British Academy to do this postdoctoral fellowship, and just look at how counter-radicalization is understood and practiced in the healthcare settings here in the UK, with a distinct eye on how Muslims are racialized. But actually, that question of how health professionals understand their duty towards um, towards this policy, that actually transformed very quickly into how do health professionals actually deal with racialization. And this became actually really quite significant, insofar as when I'm going to talk about color blindness, and then drawing links between what we just mentioned before, hostile environment. If we think about hostile environment, we think about, the war on drugs in terms of stop and search, the war on terror. We're going to find all these common links in terms of racialization processes and how policies are sort of built upon them, specifically in a post-racial age. And that's sort of the one thing I'm going to be emphasizing. Um, I'm not so sure if you see my presentation slide or the...
Yep, we can see it perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So moving on. I think there's something to be said whereby right now, obviously, racism in healthcare has sort of come to the fore, especially through COVID. Um, and, there's a really fantastic quote by Nasru and his colleagues, talking about the various sort of different inequalities which exist. And I'm not going to read out the whole quote. It's just trying to come to this understanding that there's all these historical processes underpinned by racism, which the pandemic have made very clear, right? So if we think about the various effects of prevent hostile environment, all these other, all these policies and strategies which exist, the pandemic was really, I think, very revelatory, whereby it can no longer be sort of a question of, are there differences in sort of discrimination, whatever it might be, when it comes to health disparities. And I think it's important to start off there, But equally important to start off, I think when we're talking about racism, I think there's a lot of discussions on racism without, at least coming from myself, I think I used to talk about racism without really introducing what I mean by racism. And I think it seems to be that racism is often discussed, as we've heard in various presentations here as well, um, you know, as something that's it's very, very important. I think for this purpose of this presentation, I need to make a distinction between illiberal racism and liberal forms of racism. To this, I was inspired just recently, for example, by a book called Reactionary Democracy, um, which makes this distinction. And illiberal racism is a form, is a sort of racisms we often think about when we hear the word racism. It's this form of traditional racism, this sort of hatred, demonization of entire groups. Often there we think about neo-Nazis, we think about KKK, you know, we think about, you know, wholesale demonization of a group. Whereas the liberal form of racism has become far more significant, I think, in this day and age, because the liberal form of racism often operate upon particular ideological registers, so the register of nationalism, of capitalism. If we think about racialized minorities, who is, you know, who's a worthy migrant to these nation states. And I wrote a short editorial on during the pandemic when the vaccine was discovered in Germany by the Turkish couple, you know, and suddenly they were, you know, they were heralded as amazing success stories of immigration in Germany, right? And there's this idea of the model citizen, right? But that is a liberal form of racism whereby, you know, those racialized minorities who operate in this case under the auspices of racial capitalism, that, you know, they're of benefit to the nation state, to the exclusion then of those bad immigrants, you know, those bad racialized minorities who are not of benefit, you know, to society. And that good example, the best example to that is really the whole Brexit campaign itself. So it's not a wholesale demonization. It operates very subtly on all these various registers. I think for me, nationalism and capitalism being the biggest ones. And to that, there's also the point of color blindness. Now, color blindness is something that's been discussed quite extensively. Color blindness features very prominently in my own work, in my writings, because when we're thinking about color blindness, I'm drawing here from Michelle Alexander. She wrote the fantastic book, The New Jim Crow, and she explains how colorblindness is, in fact, what's led to the mass incarceration of the Black community in the United States, whereby issues of race are either erased or abstracted. You know, we're not, you know, it's no longer very sort of explicitly drawing on distinctions between very overt racial categories. I'm going to talk about this when we look at Prevent, to be able to sort of outline how that's operating towards Muslims here in the UK. And maybe just to begin to give a case example of a racialized Muslim woman who wears the niqab, so the face veil. And she went to seek therapy here in the UK for trauma. And the therapist told her that one of the signs, one of the indications of successful treatment will be her ability to remove her face veil. And obviously she was struck. This, you know, this was, you know, it was she was very vulnerable at that moment. And, you know, it was a very powerful thing for the therapist to say. The two things I want to sort of draw out from this example was that the therapist was saying this with a smile on their face, right? They're trying to be supportive. They're trying to help this Muslim woman. And the second thing is that the Muslim woman then was also immediately very, very scared of a Prevent referral. And I'm going to sort of outline how all these things operate at the same time. I think one of just the final things I'll quickly introduce, which I often have to explain much more to mental health professionals, is just thinking about how Muslims are racialized. The APPG definition that was had a very broad civil society consensus and then was rejected by the government is that Islamophobia is rooted in racism, is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And we know from Omin and Wanant that groups are racialized according to dominant ideologies. Nationalism, it being a dominant ideology that we know centers or is a racialized register. A particular social conflict would be also the war on terror. The war on terror is a racialized social conflict. It was born out of with a racial distinction. You know, domestic terrorism is something that's actually very new in terms of discussions, but terrorism or the war on terror and counterterrorism as a whole, as a discipline, and as a global strategy, has is born really out of a sort of a racialized distinction between groups. And so there's something here important to remember, that Islamophobia, among, if we think about dominant ideologies, we think about social conflicts, we know that these aren't just individualized processes, but rather that they serve power in some shape or form. And here it's really important to think about, if we think about it in terms of prevent, which I'm going to introduce and get at, but if we think about Islamophobia, the sort of signifiers that we've seen in the post 9/11 era, you know, let's say the signifier of the hijab and the niqab that was mentioned previously. I mean, there is a history of Orientalism and civilizational superiority, which especially the war on terror has used and translated into sort of its imperial projects, right? The wars, the war on Afghanistan and Iraq drew heavily on these very sort of Orientalist gendered depictions of liberating the Muslim woman. You know, and that then is returned domestically on like hijab policies and things like that across the global north. Racialized people being seen as racialized Muslim, even when they're not. You know, we know nationalism has been quite significant and is growing, and the picture of sort of these non-white migrants and refugees entering, and they are also racialized as Muslims. And of course, the war on terror has its own history, you know, any sort of religious practice, that's why it's called Muslimness, growing the beard, putting on the headscarf, those are embodied signifiers. All these things I'm mentioning about signifiers, these are all embodied, that are sort of encoded and translated onto individuals. You know, those who benefit from that in the war on terror has been the military industrial complex specifically. Now, the prevent policy, for anyone here, I think everyone here probably knows prevent policy, but I'll just quickly give a brief reminder. The prevent policy is a duty upon public bodies that individuals who work in these public bodies have due regard in identifying and referring individuals they suspect might be vulnerable to radicalization, i.e. might become terrorists in the future. So if you go through training, which I'll do in a second, but the idea here is actually not very dissimilar to, if you take the London public transportation, you know, you hear this reminder, this constant refrain, see it, say it, sorted, right? So there's this idea of this public surveillance strategy that we are being responsibilized, that when we have this gut feeling, we have this something is wrong with the individual, that we don't just let it go, that you act upon that gut feeling. And in fact, one thing I've been writing about is how, in fact, prevent policy, among other policies, is about responsibilizing that gut feeling, these prejudicial associations, which I've mentioned here. Which becomes very interesting because there's a point in that's often made potentially about prevent, is that it you know, it's not overtly, let's say, addressing Muslims. You know, this is something that we see, you know, it's out to sort of capture all forms of extremism, whatever that means. But one thing I found in my research was actually very interesting because, and I didn't mention this earlier, but I hope I tried to make it clear when I was talking about the racialization of the war on terror. Across the global north, so much research so far, until now, I mean, it's almost unequivocal, has demonstrated how the notion of threat, the notion of risk towards national security is racialized to Muslims. And this is something that's really, really significant. So the threat of terrorism is and has been demonstrated to be very much racialized to Muslims, so much so that studies have shown that if you just promote counterterrorism, or if you have this counterterrorist game and it has no relation to Muslims whatsoever, that following that, anti-Muslim discrimination or anti-Muslim attitudes actually increase, just because terrorism is so commonly associated with the racialization of Muslims in public consciousness. And Prevent recognizes that. The government recognizes that. And what you see is what I call this performative colorblindness in the prevent policy and prevent strategy, whereby it's recognizing that the British public will immediately associate threat and terrorism with Muslims. And so here's a slide. This isn't a picture that was taken from me. It was taken by a psychiatrist, a racialized Muslim psychiatrist. He saw this slide during his prevent training, and he was very angry, and he sent it to me. And he put that red arrow there that you can see. And the slide, it says, what factors might make a child vulnerable to radicalization? And the answers are deprivation, bullying, attending the local mosque, adolescence. And so he put the red arrow there at attending the local mosque, you know, feeling very upset. What factors might make a child vulnerable to radicalization? And then you're supposed to basically check mark everything but attending the local mosque. But in a way, there's so much to draw on this slide alone, right? One thing that we can see that the slide is trying to do is it's recognizing that, hey, people are going to associate terrorism with Muslims, right? So the point of this slide is a very banal form of sort of anti-racism, whereby, like, look, you know, is it a Muslim child attending a local mosque? No. Is it you know, a Muslim woman putting on a hijab? No, right? So there's this constant raising of race and erasing of race. So it's sort of raising it and erasing it, raising it and erasing it. And it's very performative. This is what I find also so tragically hilarious about this slide, is that it's two things really. One, in a way, it's reifying, it's reproducing the reality that people will make this connection between practice, religious practice, and threat and radicalization. And actually, a study recently found that 1/3, it was a study conducted, it was a survey conducted by Hope Not Hate. They found that 1/3 among conservative voters in the UK do not want a mosque built in their locality. And so here there's this idea of attending the local mosque, right? The very symbol of the mosque itself is actually quite significant. But what's funny, I think, to me, is also the fact that let's pretend someone actually clicks that attending the local mosque because they believe it. What happens is that you go to another slide that tells you, well, you're wrong. Attending a local mosque has nothing to do with with radicalization, please go back and check mark the right boxes. And then the person goes back, they check off attending a local mosque, and then they finish their training and they end up with a prevent certificate, right? And here we have to ask ourselves, is this sort of legitimate anti-racist training, or are we actually almost green lighting almost anyone who has prejudicial thoughts? There's no way of flagging people who have prejudicial attitudes, who actually I would say this commonsensical association between religious practice and terrorism. Another form, and this is perhaps the one I've been writing about the most, of the way racism is abstracted in a post-racial era, whereby we're not dealing with racism proper, but racism is sort of being always constantly raised and erased, is this notion that, especially through psychological theories and paradigms, that we're all equally susceptible to radicalization. So myself and everyone here listening into this presentation, we're all equally vulnerable to radicalization if our psychological configuration is vulnerable enough, and a virus, the ideological virus, enters into our configuration at those moments of vulnerability, then any of us can become extremists. Any of us can become future terrorists. And so psychological theory, this idea that we all share, different forms of psychological processes, be it like when it comes to, whatever, anger or emotional upheaval, or, social and group dynamics, all these things, is a way of avoiding talking about the racialization of Muslims. So it makes it more akin to that everybody's a psychologist. Keep an eye out for the emotional, the emotional sort of appearances of your students, of your clients, of your patients, without recognizing that really what's going to happen is that, certain emotions of certain embodied people are going to be emphasized over others. But psychological theory is very beneficial in avoiding discussions on racism. So I'll quickly just go through some cases. I'll start with the one here on the top right about a racialized white GP woman who she was sitting in her practice, and a racialized Muslim man came in. And when I say racialized Muslim man, I mean to say here the signifiers where he had a long beard, and he was wearing also something called the thobe, so sort of this long garment. And it's fine. The racialized white GP woman, she admitted to me she was already critical of Prevent. So the man is sort of sitting down and they're having a casual conversation, and he mentions that he's interested in homeschooling his kids. And all of a sudden she's like, whoa, is this a Prevent referral? And she was very disturbed by the thought that Prevent somehow just entered into the space. And there's two things to really draw on this. First of all, here, the significance of the racialization of that individual. We have to ask ourselves, if the patient was another racialized white woman, and she spoke about her interest in homeschooling her children, would the thought have arisen? Would Prevent have arisen in the intersubjective space between that GP and the patient? And we can almost unequivocally just say no, right? The reason why it came up with this racialized Muslim man is because there's so much discourse surrounding integration being securitized, right? Like one of the ways I talk about counter-radicalization, counter-extremism is that it's not doing anything new. What counter-radicalization, counter-extremism is doing is that it's securitizing long-standing integration debates across the global north. So what was previously prior to 9/11 being, Muslims better integrate or, get out of our country, is now, 20 years later, is now Muslims better integrate or they're potentially security threats. And so we see the link there, but also I think what I found is why I always start with this example is because it demonstrates very acutely the impact of a policy on the minutia of relationships. She then told me she desisted from going down the road of asking more questions because she was afraid he might potentially say something that might provoke more reason in her to make a prevent referral, and she didn't want to do that. So it actually disrupted the clinical space. It changed the way that conversation would have went down. And it's really also important when we think about the impact of prevent. It's not necessarily just a question of statistics. It's not just a question of how many people are referred and not referred. But when we think about policy and we think about the impact of policy, it really almost invades, especially something, a duty like prevent, it really invades almost every element of the space. A BME staff member, he's a Muslim chaplain. He told me about a mental health professional calling him on the phone. This is the blue box in the top in the middle. And the mental health professional is saying, I have a patient who just put on a kufi, which is just this piece of cloth on the top of the head. Is that a sign of radicalization? To which the Muslim chaplain responded, I'm wearing a kufi. I thought it just brings up the banality of these signifiers, right? But also brings up the sort of awkwardness that Muslim staff have to go through, which becomes this affective form of self-surveillance. You become very acutely aware of your own racialization, and I'm going to get to that very soon. The two major examples I'm going to draw on very quickly are the two in the bottom, and I'm going to try to say them as quickly as possible just for the sake of time. Both of them deal with a racialized psychiatrist who are sharing with me these stories individually. One was telling me that about she's a psychiatrist and she's working with a mental health team, and they were seeing a patient who had converted to Islam. And already her conversion to Islam, and there's something very important here about conversion, which needs to be raised, but I can't go into it right now. But anyway, the patient had converted to Islam, and suddenly the team was wondering if this was an issue of radicalization, or at least it made the team feel uneasy. The girl in question was suffering from severe domestic abuse. And at one point, she also put on the headscarf. And it was at that point when she put on the headscarf where the team now started heavily discussing the threat of radicalization over and above the issue of domestic abuse that she was experiencing at home. And the psychiatrist was she was so upset by this. She was saying, why are we talking about radicalization? Why don't we just focus with the things at hand? But it lent itself to this idea of, these moral panics in society. The team was drawing on a different register of logic, which had clinical significance of what was the thing that was most important for both society and this young Muslim convert. Now, I don't believe a prevent referral was made, but again, it heavily disrupted the whole clinical process. The opposite example, and I think this example is really, really interesting and really important, especially today in this day and age, because counter-extremism is about to go very broad to try to capture as much, as many pre-criminals as possible. And I hope to be able to end with a slide on that. But I was speaking with a racialized Muslim psychiatrist, and he was telling me about the case of a white man who was very violent on the streets. So he would go out on the street and he would punch the homeless. A very sort of egregious account of behavior. And talking with the patient, the racialized Muslim psychiatrist, he noted how this patient was sort of regurgitating this sort of hostility towards homelessness, which comes from, you know, this sort of neoliberal architecture, you know, the hostile architecture of trying to put spikes in different places so the homeless are not seen in public and sort of, you know, cast aside in society. And he found there was room here for addressing this patient's ideology. So he made a prevent referral towards this racialized white man who's beating up people on the streets, who's violent on the streets. And the safeguarding lead rejected the prevent referral and stated that this isn't the sort of ideology we're looking for. Now, there's a lot to draw here also on in terms of racialization as well. You know, here we have to consider what it would mean if it was a racialized minority, and especially a racialized Muslim man who was being violent on the street. But moreover, this notion of ideology becomes really interesting because we see here immediately sort of this privileging of whiteness. And that's what it is. That's what any racialized social conflict immediately privileges whiteness. It's not to say, again, that white people are not referred to prevent and counter terrorism, but that their bodies alone are insufficient. There are no racialized signifiers on their bodies alone to warrant any suspicion, right? It's often usually at the point of them having displayed some overt behavior or statement that is explicitly associated with some kind of far-right group or some explicit form of violence, which brings them down that direction. Whereas with all the racialized Muslim cases I've been bringing up, it's putting on the headscarf, it's practice, it's simply also just not being white. You know, I know of one case of a racialized Syrian, I believe, who was an asylum seeker. He was referred to prevent simply because they came from the Middle East, but they weren't even Muslim. And it raises really interesting sort of discussions on how racialization operates, the war on terror operates towards communities outside the racialized Muslim community. I think for the sake of time, I am going to end very soon. I wrote another article specifically looking at how racialized Muslim staff have been experiencing the prevent policy. And it's really important just to mention very quickly this point of affective surveillance. There was the notion of fear was very significant. You know, staff were very frightened of speaking out against prevent, which is not difficult to understand because counterterrorism, the war on terror, is a moral strategy. It's dividing between the good and the bad. You know, the people who are worthy and unworthy in society, and in a way, then speaking out against counterterrorism puts you on the side of those who appear to be supportive of terrorists. This racialized white woman who's not a Muslim, you know, when I asked her why she doesn't speak out against prevent, she says, I'm really frightened. And I asked her, what are you frightened of? She says, I'm frightened I'll be targeted by political powers. I'm frightened I'll be attacked in the press. I'll be excluded. I'll be taken to be a terrorist friend. And this was much worse. This experience this affective surveillance was much worse among racialized Muslim staff who were critical. Now, everyone I'm talking about here is critical because obviously a lot of staff will just, many staff will just kind of go through it and just forget about it. I'm talking right now with staff who have an issue. And the question is, what do you do with this issue when you experience it? And the main response among the 16, 17 staff that I interviewed was self-censorship. They didn't do anything. There are other points related to that, which I can maybe just share in terms of the article. I can share the article with everyone. But I just want to bring up something that's actually really important, and I'll just end on this very quickly, is that things are actually getting much worse because right now through Freedom of Information requests, we found out very recently that the government, UK government, is launching this something called Project Cicero, which is the sort of national launch of mental health hubs for alleged extremists and pre-criminals. It's not forensic setting. So people who are referred to Prevent, they're going to be assessed for their mental health and sort of being treated in these settings, which, as the police themselves describe it, is this perfect merger of police security and mental health. And it's something that's really is unprecedented. And we're going to be launching, so I'm a co-author on this report, and we're launching on Wednesday. But, you know, I'll just maybe end with this case example up. You know, right now we're seeing this convergence on so many different themes. We're thinking about surveillance, we're thinking about securitization of mental health, we're thinking about racialization, we're thinking about all these themes. The police give out this case study of this 38-year-old man who appears to be acting strange around around, like, I think it was tourist sites, and it's a really interesting, whereby now he was sort of picked up by this counterterrorism team and sort of forwarded to these mental health hubs for treatment. But this case, I'm just going to end on it, I think really heavily signifies the colorblindness of these hubs. You know, who and what constitutes odd behavior is really something that we need to start thinking about more broadly, but especially given the current developments. So I'm just going to end right now on that point, and I'll stop sharing. If anyone has anything to say, I'd be really keen on hearing any comments or questions.
Thanks so much for that, Tarek. That was really fascinating. And I was sort of making plenty of notes as well. Happy to sort of open up the floor for anyone who has questions for Tarek or discussion points. Anastasia?
Thanks very much, Tarek. That was really fascinating. Thanks for sharing with us some of your research. I really liked some of the conceptualizations, and especially the effective aspect that you mobilize in your research, because I work on effect, and I'm very interested in the trauma compartment. And I wanted to ask you, because I'm writing something on social suffering and trauma, and I wanted to ask you, do you have any insights in terms of trauma generated in healthcare professionals because of the racializations that occur and the embedding of policy of racializations such as Prevent? Do you have findings that I can also draw on from your studies?
Yeah, I actually now wish I didn't go through that slide so quickly, because that one that I had mentioned, I think I can maybe just share it very quickly again.
Yeah.
Among racialized Muslim staff who were critical, and I think there's an element here that's really significant in terms of sort of this element of awareness. I won't bring up the slide right now. I think it'll just take too long for me to just fiddle around. But you know, there was one Muslim, racialized Muslim psychiatrist who was telling me, you know, he felt so he felt so embodied in that moment, and he felt like anyone can refer you, any one of his colleagues. There's a small point here important to mention that I think among in the NHS, as opposed to the university settings and school where prevent duties are also in place, there seems to be a higher proportion of staff referring other staff. This is very anecdotal, is based on a bunch of things that I've been reading and seeing. But I think there's a very sort of affective surveillance that you're being constantly watched. I think what Prevent is really doing is securitizing that experience, which actually is very quite pervasive in the Muslim community. You know, this idea that, you know, you have to watch out what you say, you know, don't speak out too explicitly about political issues, you know, let alone Palestine, for example. So I think what staff are experiencing in that moment, which is, very disruptive, is because they didn't expect it to be coming up there in their work settings. So one racialized psychiatrist was saying, you know, you don't feel safe. You don't feel safe. He kept on repeating it, actually. He's like, you don't feel safe. You don't feel safe. You don't feel like your colleagues won't report you, right? So all of a sudden, you know, it was very invasive. I think I've been wondering myself how much I should frame it in terms of trauma and how much I should frame it in terms of affect. And I think it's because I have this affinity to this idea of affective surveillance, this sort of embodied experience that you're constantly feeling watched. The reason for that is because I think it is far more pervasive. And it's something that racialized minorities generally have been talking about. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. And if you get a minute to send me your paper, I would love to read it and cite it. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I'd be really keen on talking about this with you further as well.
Sure. Thanks, Tarek, and thanks for joining us today.
Any other questions? Eleanor?
Yes, I mean, several thoughts here. We have another, beyond Prevent, we have something that's currently being discussed, particularly in universities, and that is the IHRA. And I think that too may have the same effect. And of course, we now have another wave of Israeli-Palestinian conflict again, in a very fundamental way. And so I'm just wondering to what extent this is going to pile up another dimension of this affective traumatizing, worrying about what your colleagues and also what the students are going to say about you, because the case at Warwick was brought by a student, of course, you know, against the staff member. So that's also, I think, just want to throw in the pot. I think the other thing I just want to, which strikes me, is your distinction between illiberal and liberal racism. I think the whole thing is really fluid. And I think what you're talking about is actually shift back to illiberal racism, where, because precisely Muslims as a whole are under attack, right? So I'm a bit, I think we need to see the fluidity that over time it can shift very quickly.
Yeah, those were two really great points. Thank you so much. You know, starting with the latter one, I absolutely agree. And in fact, you know, David Goldberg talks about how Muslims themselves represent the death of Europe, so to speak, and much of the political discourse across the global north has come to sort of reproduce that. So I think there's, you know, what we're seeing in France, what we're seeing all over, is really the growth of illiberal racism. But I think liberal racism itself you know, I think the fluidity between the two, I think really has to be highlighted, as you were mentioning. I think absolutely one sort of builds upon the other. I think also with Palestine, so I should mention my own definition of Islamophobia, which I guess I didn't share, but I draw on Salman Saidi for this, which is sort of the management of ideal Muslim thought and behavior. Islamophobia, in a way, is about managing what an ideal Muslim citizen should be, whereby their citizenship is always in question. And Palestine has been central to that. You know, I mean, really anything where there is any sort of political thought or a political opinion, you know, we know in the history of the prevent policy, presentations and, you know, students who were active in the Palestinian movement. I mean, just a widespread, you know, cases of students being referred to prevent through their interest in Palestine. And I think you really touched on how much, you know, the government is really trying to find a positivist, universal understanding of extremism. They've been pushing for that for a very long time. They haven't found one, but it'll always come back down to the sort of the I guess the political issues which are most pertinent to Muslims at the moment, right? And I think that's often the case of the sort of grievances that becomes politicized. If we're talking about the management of ideal Muslim political thought and subjectivity, you know, Palestine ends up being one of them. And then obviously IHRA and other things are then in there.
But can I say that actually the interesting thing is also there's a management going on of Jewish staff and students at the same time, because it's also the same. That's why it's talking about it as a management or a governance, the same thing is happening. It's becoming, you know, inadmissible. Obviously it's a slightly different way, but that whole Palestinian issue is kind of presenting an inadmissible positioning towards it.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Eleanor. Any other questions? I have a couple myself. Actually, I can just put it in one, I guess. I was just thinking about sort of the post-racial space that you're talking about. And we've been having conversations at Middlesex, obviously, about the scope for institutional transformation and progress when it comes to kind of anti-racism and decolonization, and the scope for, through dialogue and sort of self-education and collaborative sort of change and reform, whether we can create an institution or a sector in which both illiberal and illiberal racisms are, you know, if we want to talk about those, and I completely agree with Eleanor that they are sort of very fluid, you know, are sort of exposed and challenged. But I'm, you know, when you were talking about sort of the medicalization or the psychologization of racism, I was thinking about Kehinde Andrews' sort of psychosis of whiteness, and he's incredibly pessimistic about the scope for, through dialogue, through rational dialogue, for hegemonies of whiteness to be challenged purely because they are in effect ideological and irrational. And I wonder whether you think there's any of that scope within the NHS, and particularly given, you know, as you said, sort of the banality of anti-racisms that make it so easy for people, even people who are themselves racialized, to reproduce these sort of harmful discourses.
I think that's really the golden question, right? I think that's the golden question that we're all sort of contending with at the moment. I actually, incidentally, I just published a commentary in the Journal of Sociology of Health and Illness. It's called the Muddle of Institutional Racism in the NHS. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is sort of track on how sort of the failure of tackling institutional racism, because there's been a lot of effort in tackling institutional racism. and sort of trying to understand why it's constantly failing, while at the same time also sort of trying to bring in the racialization of like of Muslims and migrants and refugees, if you think about hostile environment and prevent and other things, and sort of bring that into the fore. I think I personally am quite pessimistic, because I'll be honest, I'm definitely open to changing my mind. I think neoliberal forms of governance are, they're especially adverse to illiberal forms of racism, right? So these outward expressions of hostility and all that, I think neoliberal forms of governance really do value representation politics, diversity, etc., and sort of bring people together, and creating this air and atmosphere that racism is an issue of the past if we're all sort of coming together and addressing it. But I think in a way it's, I do feel it is often very superficial, because ultimately these ideologies, talking about nationalism, for example, is on the rise. And there's so much that we know of how policies, especially in the NHS, there's a really great, there was a really great research, an article that found that NHS is really heavily top-down governed, right? Like, if a policy is being established all the way on top, and that policy is fundamentally politically motivated, right? So we're talking about politics-based evidence, not evidence-based politics, right? So it's politics preceding the strategy. And all of the NHS basically follows suit, then that entire process from politics taking precedence over evidence to its sort of top-down injunction onto every sector of the NHS, to sort of the politics itself favoring, nationalism, among other things. I personally have some cause of concern, but I'm also very, I don't want to be pessimistic for the sake of it. I think I'm open to changing my mind and thinking how we can go work through this.
Fantastic, thanks, Tarek. I'm sort of on the same page with you as well. Kasia.
Hi, Tarek. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, considering the sort of overarching monitoring and surveillance of Muslims, from like kindergarten all the way up to university, like in what spaces do you feel like healing can take place, and not the healing that is kind of neoliberal healing of, wellness and all that is, available for some groups, but actually like healing as a form of justice. Like, can that happen in the context of where we are now in terms of like Western liberal democracy? Can that be within that? Does it have to be outside of that? And more concretely, maybe some examples of that.
Yeah, that's a really, really excellent question. Thank you so much for that. That question has been preoccupying me really heavily, I'll be honest with you. So I spend a long time thinking about that question. I think there's always pockets of resistance in general to anything anyway. So I mean, I'm just gonna flag that. But I'll mention one thing. I think if we're talking about mental health, I think in general, there's really been a lack of a concerted effort of finding a safe space for individuals. So I get a lot of people, because I'm also a practicing psychologist. I get a lot of people come to me specifically just because they know I'm safe to talk to. And it actually blows open so much of the discourse around culture and psychology. A lot of issues in psychology are like, when it comes to minorities, is sort of relegated to like ethnic matching. Okay, we need to find like a Muslim psychologist for like a Muslim patient to an extent, right? Besides maybe sensitivity training and cultural diversity, whatever. But, you know, one thing I found that was really interesting is I've been also getting people who aren't racialized Muslims come to me because they because I'm outspoken, they deem me as politically safe. And, you know, there hasn't really been that discussion of, okay, forget about ethnic matching. What about like this sort of political sort of sanctuary that people feel like they can go and share their vulnerabilities without it be living, sort of existing under the securitized gaze, as you're talking about. And that I'm really trying to find a way to work with others to find a space that we can have for people like that. And I think as more and more people become aware of Prevent, as these mental health hubs, as I mentioned before, get rolled out and become more public, I think will become more and more necessary. But I do think that there are examples of things happening. Healing Justice London, for example, is a very politically conscious sort of therapeutic space in London. They do really fantastic work. And I think they're a good case example of responding to the sort of situation, circumstances that we're in, rather than saying, oh, we need to just create mental health for everyone, right? But really making it embedded within the circumstances. I hope I answered your question, by the way. I'm not so sure. I might have veered off a little bit.
Fantastic. So I think we might leave it there. I think a couple of us have got sort of other meetings to go to. That was sort of really fantastic, Tarek, and it would be great if we could get you sort of more involved in the SPRC going forward. I'm sure Eleanor agrees with me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was
one of the things, can I just say, at our next meeting, I'd like us to discuss moving out of just our school and involving people much beyond it, because I think the SPRC should be about people with shared interests, irrespective of where they're located in the university. I think there's a lot of people also in education, and I think some people in psychology that we need to think about bringing in, you know, so we can have a lively forum.
Absolutely, absolutely, and bringing in new forms of evidence and looking at new kind of institutional contexts and otherwise, and you know, we've shown today that there is very much sort of shared kind of theoretical as well as sort of analytical spaces there for discussion. So I'm just going to stop the recording.